In today's environment of a global pandemic, we certainly see a silver lining here as well. We hope to seize this opportunity of making our hub of exchanges into a truly global ideas sharing platform. Here we are. That's why we're launching our first ever webinar with Professor Roger Ames of Peking University. Professor Ames needs little introduction. Currently, he's a humanities chair professor at Peking University and an academic director of our research center. He is one of the most accomplished Confucian philosopher and translator of ancient Chinese classics in today's world. He is the former editor of Philosophy East and the West and the founding editor of China Review International. Professor Ames has authored and co-authored several interpretive studies of Chinese philosophy and culture, including Thinking Through Confucius, Anticipating China, and then Confucian Role Ethics of Vocabulary. So before I give the stage to Professor Ames, I want to reiterate the housekeeping rules. When you were listening to Professor Ames' lecture, feel free to type up your questions in the chat box, either in Chinese or English, whatever language you feel most comfortable with, okay? And then at the end of the lecture, I will actually pick out some of the questions for Professor Ames to address. Okay, so I think without further ado, let's welcome Professor Roger Ames. Please, Roger. Yeah, you need to unmute. Roger, you need to unmute yourself. Can you guys unmute Roger?
Roger is already unmuted, but he needs to agree.
Okay, yeah. I think they send a request to you and then you have to agree to unmute yourself, Roger.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Now it's great. Wonderful.
These technologies, my goodness. Just before I begin, on my first slide is my email address. And if you want a copy of the slides, if you want to ask me a question, please send me an email directly. I'm happy to continue our conversation. So how do I, oh, there we go, okay. Where I want to start is John Dewey describes two alternative worldviews, two alternative ways of seeing the world. One of them is a one-world ecological way of thinking. We must either find the appropriate objects and organs of knowledge in the mutual interactions of changing things, an organic Darwinian kind of worldview that Dewey wants to advocate for, and also one that has great meaning in the Confucian tradition. But the alternative is to escape the infection of change, we must seek them, that is, the objects and organs of knowledge, in some transcendent and supernal region. This is the two-world dualistic thinking that we associate with the classical Greek tradition, and a worldview that even though this way of thinking, God is dead, Nietzsche's term, even though this way of thinking has been discredited in the Western tradition, it still has a great impact on common sense, on the prevailing common sense. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to sort of look at that two-world cosmology of classical Greece, where the starting point is a single-ordered divine universe governed by natural and moral laws, ultimately intelligible to the human mind. this is a world of things. This is a world where noun has privilege. And it's reductionistic in the sense that there is some privileging of God over world. There's privileging of form over change. There's privileging of theory over practice, privileging of soul over body. And as I say, even though there's been a sustained critique within the Western tradition, this way of thinking is still very much part of common sense. Now, the true world response to robotics, to artificial intelligence, begins from this idea of a single-ordered cosmos, a universe. And it's populated by human beings where there's a chain of being, and the human beings have privilege. There's a speciesism, 中类主义. There's a human exceptionalism, 人类, 例外论. There's the pathetic fallacy that makes the entire cosmos a blueprint, a pattern that celebrates the human being and the goals of the human being. Now, this world, its concept of knowledge production depends upon exclusive categories. A and not A. When you think of Aristotelian logic, the law of non-contradiction. And so these categories are fixed. There's no fluidity among the categories. Individual things are standalone, essential, discrete objects. And so this is a world of objects. And it has a means-end instrumentality. That is, that the entire cosmos is patterned in order to serve the kind of assumptions that are built into a teleology, a Moody-Lewin. And you have this idea of discrete things, individual agencies, the idea of control, the idea of rationality as being what is defining of the human being. And so what is really important here is the concept of God, the concept of creativity is that creativity belongs to God. Creativity is part of a pattern. And so when you think of human creativity, creativity becomes something audacious, something problematic, something immoral. You have this idea of Prometheus, a Promethean conception of creativity. And so in English, if you say that somebody is morally creative, that's very insulting. People aren't morally creative. If you say that somebody is financially creative, it means they're stealing your money. If you say that somebody is religiously creative, it means that they are participating in some new bizarre religion. If you say that somebody is the word creativity is used for fiction, it's used for art, but it's not used for the central ideas in the human experience. And so the concept of robot comes into the English language in a 1920 play by Karl Čapek, Czech playwright, where a robot is a term derived from the Latin robato, meaning slave, meaning drudgery. And so the idea of robot has to do with enslavement. And so you have this kind of tension between human being and robot. You have the idea, like the Promethean concept of creativity is stealing fire from God in order to create a human civilization. In doing that, that kind of human creativity becomes suspect. And so you have Goethe's Faust. You have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where human beings, Frankenstein is creating another human being. You have Nietzsche's Übermensch. You have Milton's Satan. All of these are human beings being creative, but being creative in a way that offends against the morality represented by God. And so this kind of creating a kind of technology that is rational, where rationality is the defining feature of the human being, becomes problematic in some important degree. Now, when we move to the Chinese, the Confucian worldview, Marcel Grenet, the great French sinologist, says Chinese wisdom has no need for the idea of God. Tang Juni, 中国民族无含超越意义的天的观念 that in Chinese it's 天与地天与人是分不开的. And so you have the alternative to this two world way of thinking is the one way world. Joseph Needham, Chinese ideals involve neither God nor law. Thus, the mechanical and the quantitative, the forced and externally imposed, were all absent. There's a one world, not two worlds. And so when we look to the articulation of a Confucian worldview, it doesn't matter if we're talking about the Confucian tradition, if we're talking about the Taoist tradition, the Buddhist tradition, we have to go back to the I Ching, and particularly the Da Zhuan in the I Ching, that makes explicit a way of thinking that is the interpretive context for reading texts in this tradition. And when we look at the term I Ching, I in I Ching, Book of Changes, the word changes is very ambiguous because there's many different kinds of changes. There's 变化, 迁改, 更换, 革替, and many, many more. And so when we ask the question, what kind of changes is the Book of Changes talking about? It's talking about the commentaries associate I with li I de I. And so that the I is a kind of change that is adding, that is benefiting, that is increasing. And then Guo Moreau suggests that I, in fact, is a abbreviated character for zi, meaning gifting, giving, transacting. And so the wisdom of the I Ching lies with the idea that the human experience is not lived within our skins. We're not individual. We're not discrete individual human beings. We are everything that a human being does, physically, intellectually, culturally, is transactional, is in association with other people, in association with the natural world. And so when we look at the way in which the I Ching defines technology, we begin with Fu Xi, who looks at the world, who looks at the animals of the world, the plants of the world, who looks at his own body, and who devises a vocabulary of images that provides insight into the transactional nature of the human experience. And so he begins the production of technologies by plaiting cords to make nets and traps for fishing and hunting. When Fu Xi dies, then Shen Nong arises, and he, as the great farmer, He chisels wood to shape plowshares and steams wood and blends it into plow handles and teaches farming to the people. And then he invents the midday market in order for people to barter, to exchange goods. We continue. When Shan Nong passes away, Huang Di, Yao Xun carry on this kind of work. They hollow out trees to make boats, so that they can go to all parts of the empire. They yoke oxen and ride horses. And all of this is all about yi li tianxia, in order to benefit the world. They build double doors and establish night patrols in order to secure the human community. Then they carve the mortar and pestle technology for preparing food, bow and arrow in order to secure the community. They build housing technologies. They build outer and inner coffins in order to take care of burials. And eventually, they develop writing and documents. But these later things are done by somebody called Hou Shi Xiangren. So who are the Hou Shi Xiangren? What I want to suggest is that Hou Shi Xiangren is a term that is as applicable today as it was in the I Ching, that we continue to create these technologies, and these technologies have to be consistent with the concept of Shangren, the concept of sage. So subsequent sages are alive and well in our universities today. Now, Tang Juni, in reflecting on the this Confucian cosmology, he says that when Chinese philosophers talk about the world, they're talking about the world in which we're living. That apart from this world, there's no second world. It's not even this world or a world. It's worlding. It's a process, an organic process of which we are an integral part. And so this technology that was being developed by the sages in the Book of Changes really has to do with the human being coordinating the human experience with the natural world in an effort to optimize the creative possibilities of this world. How can we get the most out of the human experience? And Tang Juni goes on to talk about how this Chinese cosmology embraces change. It doesn't deny change like the classical Greek. It doesn't privilege a perfect God, an unchanging God. It doesn't privilege form. It doesn't privilege something that is static and unchanging. But what it does is it privileges life. That the cosmology is 一种流行, 一种动态. That is 一种国强. It's a process cosmology, and there is no, apart from that, there is no underlying substratum. And so this one world response to artificial intelligence, a Confucian common sense, really doesn't have to sheng or zoren. It has to do with human becomings, 学以成人. It has to do with the recognition of the interdependence of human beings, 基于理 or 理人. It has to do with the value of deference, 中恕之道, the idea that the only way that we can grow our relationships as human beings is by deferring to other people, by deferring to our natural environment, the environment that gives us context. And so the prime value, if the prime value in the classical Greek tradition is this concept of being in itself, something that is static and unchanging, that is real, then the prime value in this tradition is the notion of sheng, is the notion of life. And so in the I Ching, we have this wonderful, this beautiful passage that says, 天地之大德曰圣, that the greatest capacity, the greatest virtuosity of the cosmos is life itself. And so it's a sheng sheng bu xi kind of cosmology that is defined, that is explained in terms of bian tong, persistence in change, that is explained in terms of qi yong, in terms of the mutuality of forming and functioning. And so in this world, there are no things. Human beings are not things. We're events. We're 事件. And everything in this world is defined in terms of its context. 一多不分管. That a person is both a unique person and is also defined by their relationships that constitute them in their relationships with other people. And so this way of thinking, this kind of a worldview, is an inclusive worldview. It's a holistic worldview. It's unbounded. It's aspectual in the sense that God and world are separate, but Dao and Wanwu are just two different ways of looking at the same experience. When we talk about a person as in terms of Ti Yong, it's non-analytical. You can't separate the Ti from the Yong. That the Ti has to do with the physicality, the intelligibility. The Yong has to do with the creativity. It has to do with the vitality. It has to do with the imagination. And so Ti Yong are not analytic categories. They're aspectual categories. This is an ecological a cosmology, an organic cosmology, a vital cosmology. And so these kinds of expressions like 天人合一, 天人相应, 天人感应, it's not about putting two separate things together, because everything is part of an inside that has no outside. 有一个内在而没有一个外在. And so the idea of 天人合一 is all about this notion of du. How can we get the most out of the relationship between the human being and the world? How can we optimize the exchange, the interface, the resonance between the human world and the natural world in which we live our lives? And so this in this worldview, human culture is not separate from the culture of the world. That human culture is like birdsong. Human culture is like falling rain. Human culture is natural, not some kind of exception to the world. And so you have this 人类文化的自然化. Let's see. And so instead of the teleology that is so important in the classical Greek tradition, what you have is you have this notion of Zhong and He. If you think of the first chapter of the Zhongyong, and so these human values, Xiao Dao, Jia, Cheng, these are not human values as opposed to cosmic values. These are human values that are integral to the cosmic order. The notion of Zhonghe is not harmony, not balance, but this idea of an optimizing symbiosis. 优化最大化工商体系. And so when we think of this idea of xiao as the prime moral imperative in the Confucian tradition, the Xiao Jing says, 夫xiao de之本也, 教之所有行也. That xiao is the basis of education in a world that takes life as its prime value. then growth is the goal. Growth in the human experience is education. Growth in the human experience is morality. That morality in a Confucian world is quite simple. Morality is the 中恕之道 is how do I grow my relationships with other people? I do it by deferring to them, understanding their needs, their values, and trying to find the most productive relationship I can with them. And so this concept of xiao has been so important in the Confucian tradition in terms of the intergenerational transmission of the cultural tradition. That what is distinctive about this Confucian tradition that makes it different from the way in which, if you think of ancient Greece and modern Greece, the relationship is very thin. If you think of ancient Egypt and modern Egypt in terms of the cultural continuities, very thin. If even Italy and Rome, Persia and Iran. But if you think of the Confucian tradition, it's each generation has the responsibility of inheriting the tradition, embodying the tradition, writing commentary on the tradition, using the tradition to address the pressing issues of the time, and then when their hair turns white, passing it on to the next generation and recommending that they do the same. And so this idea of family is a hugely important value in the Confucian tradition. It's the entry point for developing ourselves in terms of our moral competence. And so when someone asks Confucius, why aren't you in government? He makes a distinction between Jiangfu and Xinjiang. He says, I don't need to be in government. I'm in following Xiao and Qi. I am Xinjiang. I'm governing. That governance itself comes from comes out of the family. There's a Yan Fu, the great translator of Western, of Huxley, of John Stuart Mill. When he looked back on 2,000 years of imperial China, he said that if you want to talk about social and political order are 30% government. They are 70% jiazu, shizu. It has to do that the human family is a hugely important factor in the way in which governance is accomplished within this Confucian worldview. And so these ideas of xiao is not simply a human value. Again, in the Xiao Jing, in this concept of san cai, you have this idea that xiao tian zhi jing ye, di zhi yi ye, min zhi xing ye, tian di zhi jing are min shi zi zhi. Now, the idea of modeling is not imitating, it's not replicating, it's not that we're following the way of nature, it's that we're coordinating. When we model something, in the Analects it says, dang ren, rang yu shi, that in being ren, you don't yield even to your teachers. That everything must be coordinated. There must be some kind of a symmetry between the values of the natural world and a coordination of the human values together with them. And so the second value that is so important is this notion of he. And so we all know this, li zhi yong, he wei gui, he er zhi he er he, bui li jie zhi, yi bu ke xing ye. That the function of li, the function of this very important way of thinking about achieving propriety in our roles and relationships is necessary in order to achieve the kind of optimizing symbiosis that is the goal of Confucian living. And so this idea of optimizing symbiosis, when you think of the centrality of the metaphor of family, it's the governing metaphor of the Chinese tradition, with xiao as the moral imperative of the tradition. The concept of family is a strategy for getting the most out of your ingredients. That when it comes to our role in the university, when it comes to our role in the society, when it comes to our role in politics, we make a commitment, but our most fundamental commitment is to our families. If our family needs our money, if they need our time, if they need my kidney, then I have to step up. So family is a strategy for optimizing symbiosis, for getting the most out of your ingredients. When you think of Chinese cooking, you go to a German restaurant, and a menu is 2 pages. The starters, the main courses, the drinks are on the back. When you go into a Chinese restaurant, the menu is a book. And this is a Chongqing restaurant, page after page of different, using all different strategies, smell and taste and sound and season and texture and all of these different ways of trying to optimize the possibilities of the ingredients. And this is a Chongqing restaurant. If we go next door to a Chaozhou restaurant, they have another book, and it's a different book from the first restaurant. Even Sun Tzu Bing Fa is not about winning war. Sun Tzu Bing Fa is Bu De Yi. Sun Tzu Bing Fa is about how, under the worst of circumstances, when we go to war, how can we still maintain as much as we can within that kind of conflicted situation. And so when we look at Wang Chong, when he says 乡人以天下为家, 县乡家天下, that it's not 修山平天下, it's 修山家天下. And so what you have is this kind of a contrast between the teleology in the classical Greek world and this idea of optimizing symbiosis that is such a high value within the Confucian world. And so the idea that the power of human feeling in these Confucian texts is such that if the human beings can 智中和, then 天地为眼, everything in the world will be in its proper place. 万物有眼, that all things will flourish in the world. And so the human contribution to the natural world is these shared values, the zhong and the he that are expressed in the human world in terms of xiao, in terms of he, in terms of cheng, these kinds of values, but these are also cosmic values. Cheng jie tian zhi dao ye, cheng zhi jie ren zhi dao ye. That these two, and it's tian ren he yi, that these two things are not separate. It's not that one of them belongs to tian and the other belongs to ren, but these work together in order to cheng the cosmos. And so what does it mean to cheng the cosmos? Cheng ji ren ye, cheng wu zhi ye. And this is all about how the human being, in creating ourselves or also creating the world, if we can achieve in terms of du, in this Tianren He relationship, if we can achieve this kind of consummate humanity that is represented by Ren, then at the same time, what we're doing is we're creating wisdom in the world. Chang Wu Zhi. We're creating wisdom in the world. Now, what I wanted to do in finishing up today is I wanted to introduce the Taoist critique of this Confucian worldview. And so there's a wonderful story that is told in the Zhuangzi, where Zigong is gone south to Chu and he's coming back home to Lu through the state of Jin, and he passes the south bank of the Han River and he sees an old man working in the field. And so the old man is using pails in order to carry water to the field in order to grow his crops. And so Zigong wants to help him. And so he tells him about this new technology, this thing, the Diao Tong Gan, this well sweep, a way of lifting water out of the river and carrying it over with a pole and putting water into channels that will water the field. And it's, Zigong is thinking that he's really helping this man. The farmer gets really angry, and then he laughs and he says, "What I've heard from my teacher is that those who use these kinds of contrived technologies are sure to bring such contrivances into what they do, and those who are contriving what they do are sure to harbor a contriving mind." And so he's worried about this idea of qi xin. If one harbors a contriving mind in one's breast, the pure and the simple are gone. The spiritual life is unsettled, and you become something that offends against the proper way of things. And so he's saying that Dao Zhi Suo Zai Ye, that if to the extent that technologies create the human experience in a way that is not consistent with Dao, with the proper way of things, then what we're doing is technology is offending against the kind of values that human beings share with the cosmos. And so what we want to do, and I'll finish up here, is that the Taoist critique on the Confucians would say to the Taoist, you're not understanding what we're talking about. We're talking about an optimizing symbiosis. We're talking about Li, about ritual propriety. We're talking about Xiao, about family reverence. But what we know historically is that very often Confucian morality is inclined to routinize and to a kind of ossifying formalism and becomes oppressive. That this notion of Xiao has to have Zhengjian as part of it. It has to allow the younger generation to remonstrate. It has to allow the minister to remonstrate with the ruler. But very often, Xiao becomes a concept of blind obedience. Ritual propriety, Li, is a wonderful, a beautiful idea, but very often it can become something that is oppressive, a kind of dogma, a social dogma that doesn't allow for the creativity that is essential to the concept of Li. And this idea of an optimizing harmony, an optimizing symbiosis, very easily becomes simply the forced absence of dissidence, becomes a kind of it becomes he hua, the harmonization of the human experience. 知和而和，不以理解之. And so if we're not using Li, the creativity, the humanity of Li, in order to achieve this optimizing symbiosis, then all we're doing is we're creating a world that is absent of dissonance. And so the Taoist critique is really cautionary that on the one hand, we can advocate for these Confucian values, but at the same time that we have to worry that these values really live up to the idea of 后世生人, that in the creation of our technologies, that we these technologies are in service to 义利天下, are in service to the world itself. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, thank you, Professor Ames. It is really an intellectually rich lecture. I think in Chinese we would say 好烧脑啊. Anyway, so let me start with a couple questions, and then I noticed that there were some questions in the chat box already. So Professor Ames, you talked about the Confucian outlook to the world is this concept of like a one world. There's no duality that's recognized, right, in the conception, the Confucian conception. So does it mean that? Okay, I'm sort of extrapolating. I don't know if that's a correct understanding. Does it mean that there's no sharp distinction between humans and then the sort of the objectified nature, and we are in one? And then so if we extend this logic a little further, there's no sort of sharp distinction between human and the artificial beings per se. So in a way, we are all in the same kind of a web of relationships. So there's no such thing as one conquering the other or vice versa. You know, in the sense that, because there's a lot of fears, right, in the in the popular imagination about machines conquering the humans in the future, or humans need to maintain domination over the machines, lord over the machines, treat them as as slaves or mere tools and stuff. So if we use your thinking and using the Confucian perspective, in a way, that's kind of binary thinking about human versus the nature of human versus the an artificial tools or artificial machine intelligence or whatever if you want to refer to that. That's actually not a sort of Confucian way of approaching the relationship between humans and technology. Is my understanding correct?
Correct. Perfect.
Great. So can I, if I extend this further, which means when we talk about having a moral, let's say inject the moral values into machines per se, are you saying humans and machines, in fact, we share the same moral order?
Absolutely.
Right? We are in the one moral order, right? Okay, great. I think that's thank you so much. Okay, so let me a couple other. Sorry, that was my question. So.
Bing, let me just respond to that, because just to make it clear, what you said is just perfect. What I'm saying is that now robots have gone from the factory floor into healthcare, into security, into family life generally. And so if we can make sure that this kind of new technology is consistent with human values that are cosmic values, then this robotic serves a positive end. If these robots, so they are our collaborators in creating a world, just like in the world of the I Ching, Shen Nong and Fu Xi and Huang Di and so on, were creating technologies that elevated the human experience. So these technologies that we're creating elevate the human experience as long as they serve the values that are defining of the cosmos.
Great, thank you. So we actually have a number of questions coming through. So let me start with one. There's a question posed by Andrew. In Chinese, it said 儒家如何看待人工智能？人的自由意志到底存在吗？ In English, how does Confucianism treat artificial intelligence? How does Confucianism look at the artificial intelligence? Does human free will really exist?
That's a very good question, Andrew. And the answer is that the two-world way of thinking, the human being way of thinking of individuated will, is an old way of thinking. The way of thinking that prevails in the Confucian world, but it's also a way of thinking that the best Western philosophers are moving towards today. People like Michael Sandel, people like Mark Johnson, that free will is sort of the same kind of problem as autonomy. Is autonomy something that belongs to an individual person, or is autonomy, can a family be autonomous? Can a country be autonomous? Can human beings living in a world that is functioning properly be autonomous? And so the idea of locating these things with individual is the problem. We need a concept of will. We need to be projective. We need to be directive. But to think about it in terms of individuals is the problem. How can an individual tell what they are willing as opposed to what peer pressure wants them, what advertising wants them to do, and all the other kinds of things that the human being is defined in terms of drives that go way beyond the individual human being. And so it's a different way of thinking about will that isn't grounded in the concept of individual.
Okay, great. There's more questions. There's so too many questions, different devices. Okay, I'm looking at. Okay, so there's a question from there's a question from Agnes. I'm not entirely sure whether or not we get the questions right. Okay, the Agnes question is, I am curious about how Chinese philosophy would respond to possible worlds. Agnes, if you are online and if you're able to clarify what your questions are, when you say possible worlds, what you're referring to? Worlds meaning different, the worlds influenced by different cultural values, or worlds of different beings? I don't know what you're really referring to, but the question is how Chinese philosophy would respond to possible worlds. Agnes, are you on the line?
I mean, one thing, let me respond to that best I can, Dave.
Okay.
And that is that the nature of this Confucian tradition is that it is hybridic, that it is always drawing into itself what exists on the margins. Remember Zhao Tingyang, he talks about this kind of sheng xin xuanmo, this kind of centripetal harmony that is drawing things in. Well, that's the nature of the Confucian tradition, that it's constantly drawing what is outside inside. And so the idea of possible worlds is always, when the Confucian tradition encounters Buddhism, that's a different world. Buddhism becomes integral to the Confucian tradition, and Buddhism becomes recreated within the Confucian context. Sanlun, Chan Buddhism, Huayan Buddhism are Chinese Buddhisms. And so the relationship between the Confucian tradition and Western culture, when we think of our most prominent Chinese philosophers today, Li Ziho, you think of Marx, you think of Kant, you think of Confucianism, Mo Zhongshan, you think of Kant, you think of Confucianism, Tang Juni, you think of Hegel, you think of Confucianism, you think of Whitehead. And so it's the nature of the Confucian tradition to draw into itself traditions that would compete with it, and to try to use them to strengthen its own identity.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so the next question is from Wang Kun, 对吧? In Confucian views, is it possible for robots to behave like a real person and join our society? Is it possible for them to perform ritual propriety? Li.
Yeah, I can see Wang Kun. Yes, I think so. I think that in fact, if we are going to pursue robotic technologies, and if Li are really the governing human values, then we have to make sure that these robots are accommodated within the Li. But what is really important is that Li are different in every generation. And it's not simply that the robots have to accommodate themselves to the human Li, but that the human Li will change in response to the participation of robot technology within the Li. Li is not one thing. Li, like the cultural tradition, is evolving. It's progressive. It's evolutionary. It's hybridic. And so I think it's very important that, and the Confucian culture is inclusive. But what we have to do is we have to be sure that the kind of technologies, that's why 知行合一 is so important, is that the kind of technologies that come out of our practices have to make our practices more intelligent, have to make our practices more compassionate, have to make our practices of service to the world. And so that's the point, that the robotics have to be accommodated within this idea of Li. Very nice question. Thank you, Wang Kun.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is from Wang Yan. In Chinese, 中庸里对于中和有这样的论述：喜怒哀乐之谓发谓之中，发而皆众结谓之和。如何用您刚才提出来的 optimal harmony? I believe Roger mentioned the optimal symbiosis. I guess that's the word that I guess Roger used. 如何用您刚才提出的那个 optimal symbiosis 来解释 I think very considerate of Wang Yan, in fact, or he or she, I don't know, okay, put the question in English for us as well. So the doctrine of Ming explains harmony in this way. Before the feelings of pleasure, anger, sorrow, and joy are aroused, it is called equilibrium. When these feelings are aroused and each and all attain due measure and degree, it is called harmony. How is this explanation similar to your explanation of optimal symbiosis?
I think what that passage in the Zhongyong is saying is that human feelings are a powerful force in the cosmos. That we don't want to like in this Confucian tradition, human beings are 天地之心. That human beings have the capacity and the responsibility to pei tian, to be co-creators, to be sancai, to be co-creators with the cosmos. And so we have to step up and recognize the power of human feelings, and try to use those human feelings in such a way that they enable the entire cosmos to flourish. And so I think that the the Zhongyong, the first chapter is all about Tianren Heyi and how do we get the most out of that relationship. In that respect, it's the same as I Ching. How do we get the most out of the collaboration of the human being and the world around us?
Okay, so just a quick note for everyone that it's already 12:09, and because we started about 10 minutes late, so that's why obviously this is a little overrun, but we will continue for a while while more questions coming through. Okay, so if I have some other urgent matters to tend to, we would understand. You may have to leave, but I just want to let you know that because we started late, we may actually continue for a while. So, okay, this question from Yi Ran 吧叫, okay, I would love to hear your opinions on whether machines can have or be taught with human values.
What we have to do is that, like, the human being is the creator. The human being is the innovator when it comes to these technologies. And so what we have to do, it's not that they have human values, but they have cosmic values. That's the point that I'm trying to make, that we have to create our technologies in such a way that they serve the function of a flourishing cosmos. It's not simply for the human being. The human being is not separate. It's not human values. It's cosmic values. That's the point that I'm trying to make. And so when we build atomic bombs, those are not technologies that are consistent with a flourishing cosmos. When we create technologies that can destroy the world, when we create technologies that bankrupt the environment, when we create technologies that poison the water, these are not technologies that are consistent with cosmic flourishing. The real problem that we have is what the Confucian tradition recognizes is that any particular situation is going to be specific. It's going to be you're going to have to make determinations on the basis of the specificities of any situation. And so the Confucian tradition can't give a rule book. It can't say this is right and this is wrong. So what it does is it gives us these kinds of modalities, the idea of optimizing symbiosis, the idea of constantly going back to the idea of flourishing. The technologies are form. The idea of optimizing symbiosis is the idea. And so we have to constantly reform the form by going back to the idea.
Okay, great. The next question is from Kongke. Okay, this is I'm learning new words along the way as well. Human being and AI have different biological functions and structures. They may optimize symbiosis in different ways. Do you think, is it possible for AI to share the same moral values as human beings? I guess this is yet another question on along similar themes. It's a question clearly on everybody's mind. Yes, maybe Roger, you can have another go again.
Yeah. The way that I would approach this is I would say that what we don't want to do is we don't want to say nature has these values, human culture is artificial, and the human being is an exception to nature, and therefore do the technologies have to have human values? What I want to do is I want to say that Confucianism doesn't respect that kind of fragmenting of values. What Confucianism wants to advocate for is that there's a way of being in the world for everybody, including our technologies. The Book of Changes gave us examples of the technologies that were created in their time. And those technologies, by and large, the idea of the written word, the idea of transportation, the idea of a security in the community, the idea of how to prepare food, all of these have served us well. And so what we need to do is we have to make sure that the kinds of technologies that we developed are consistent with these cosmic values. We know how to cook. We know how to cook dinner. I mean, I think the example of the Chinese menu is perfect. That what we're doing there is we're cooking food, but we have to have the same kind of values when it comes to producing our technologies. For example, in one of the high values in a Confucian world is the notion of shell, is taking care of the older generation. That's a value as an old man that I like very much, But to the extent that these technologies can take care of old people, can make their lives more comfortable, can make them, can give them some happiness. This is good technology.
Okay. So I have a question from Colin. Any thoughts on the aesthetic value of I Ching?
I think that's the difference. Like what we have in the two world theory is we have a reductionistic cosmology. So everything is rationalized by a concept of God, rationalized by form, rationalized by what is permanent and unchanging. But in the I Ching cosmology, in the Confucian cosmology, it is fundamentally an aestheticism. That the notion of causality in this I Ching cosmology is that everything is relevant to anything. Nothing is excluded. And so the challenge is to get as much as we can out of everything in producing the total effect. And so it's fundamentally an aesthetic order. This is Whitehead describes aesthetic order in exactly that way. When you look at a painting, you see the painting, but then you look at all of the different details and you see how these specific details come together to create the experience of the Mona Lisa. These specific details, how do they all come together for the totality of the effect? And so that's the challenge that Fu Xi and Shen Nong and these earlier sages faced, and that is how can insight into the nature of life, of the world experience, how can we draw out of those insights the best way of being in the world? So I think the I Ching is fundamentally an aesthetic.
Okay, so I think we probably have time for a couple more questions, and then that will be coming to the end of our session. So, okay, then so another question from Andrew. 非常感谢安老师的解答。前面您的引文感觉有点以人类为中心，虽然也需要与自然和谐。这方面儒家和道家是不是差别挺大？与此相关，未来如神一样的智人，看现在的我们，会不会正如我们看原始人和其他生灵一样？I guess it's a question from Andrew. Say, thank you so much for your answers. The quotations and citations you used appear to be a bit anthropocentric, even though you do talk about the harmony with the nature. Perhaps there's differences here between Confucianism and Taoism. Relatedly, I guess that's sometime far in the future, like a godlike super intelligence, machine intelligence, the way they look at us humans, would that be very similar as that we now look at the primitives and then other forms of beings at this point. So,
yeah, that's sort of the kind of fears that come with these technologies, the singularity, that play that I talked about by the Czech writer Karl Čapek, who invented the word robot. Eventually, the robots come back and kill the human beings who created them. And so that way of thinking, I think, belongs to that kind of Promethean concern about human creativity, that we can certainly produce technologies that are monsters. We've done that. The kind of weaponry that we have as human beings, the way in which our technologies are threatening, climate warming and environmental degradation and food and water shortage and all of the ways in which technologies have offended against the good world. That monster of a technology has already been created. What we need is these kinds of Confucian values to take our technologies and go back and look at this idea of optimizing symbiosis, look at these cosmic values that should be governing the production of technologies.
Okay, so we probably have one last question, and then we're coming. In fact, we are coming to 2:20 already. But let's ask. I'm going to ask one more question, and then there's a question which is relating to the specific era that we're living through right now. Anyway, okay. The question relating to the talk is: Could Professor Ames provide a Confucian criteria for AI selfhood? Selfhood, 自己
Yeah.
自我.
Yeah. I think the criterion is the same as the criterion for everybody. And that is that if there's only one person, there's no person. That we become people because we live in our relationships with other people. And so the way in which the AI, the way in which the robot achieves its own identity is by virtue of the quality of relationships that it's able to achieve within a world of other robots and within a world of people and within a natural world. And so it creates its identity out of its relationality, not out of something that can be implanted in the technology itself.
Okay, so I think before we close, there's one question that a lot of people actually would like to ask, and it's not necessarily directly related to the topic of the talk, but certainly related to the current environment that we live in. So that speaks to the pandemic, okay? So how do you view the role of cultures in different countries' responses to COVID-19 crisis?
And that's a wonderful question. My own sense is that if anybody wanted proof that cultures make a difference, we just look at our present circumstances. What happened in China was that China acted quickly to contain the virus, and you can say that comes with government, that comes with a kind of imposition on the people. But I would say that it comes out of this notion of Li, that there is a sense of interdependence. There's a sense of family. There's a sense of responsibility, as well as freedom, that is so important in this Confucian tradition that has really served the Chinese people well. And it's not simply Chinese people, it's Confucian people. If we look at Hong Kong, if we look at Singapore, if we look at Japan and Korea, it's Confucian people have been able to contain the virus. when we look at what is happening in Europe, what is happening in America in particular, is this idea of individualism. It's this idea of the free will of the individual. It's the idea of, if I don't want to wear a mask, I don't have to wear a mask. It's that mentality is the mentality of the gun. It's the idea that my freedom is guaranteed by my right to have a gun. And so I'd like to close the lecture today. I want to thank, like many of my Chinese friends, including the Berggruen people, sent us masks because they could see that either we didn't have masks or that Western people are not smart enough to understand that the mask is an essential factor in containing the virus. So wherever we are right now, Hawaii, we've been very lucky. In Hawaii, which is a very Asian kind of a population, we're 70% Asians and Pacific Islanders in Hawaii. We've been able to contain the virus, but the mainland America is out of control, and I don't know how you go back. I don't know how they can solve that situation.
Great. On that note, optimistic note, we're going to close today's seminar. And thank you guys so much for joining on Sunday afternoon. I think, you have a lot of questions, and there's still many people still online. So we really appreciate it. And then thank you so much, Professor Ames, for giving us a wonderful intellectual treat for the weekend. So perhaps we can flick to the first page where you have your email address. I know some people ask for having copies of your slides, and then there were people continue to have questions, and then perhaps they could send the questions and a request to you directly. I think, okay, with that, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Roger.
Good night from Honolulu.
Yes, good night. Yes, thank you.